You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I guess this first part of the conversation, I just want to take kind of a big picture, just kind of 3 questions I want to put out here, and we can tackle them. 1, how real is the issue of Jews feeling ambivalent toward or alienated from Israel? Who and or what is to blame? And what can and should be done about it? Peter, as I said, you're sort of responsible for us being here, so why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Well, thanks. I am genuinely really grateful to be invited to be on this panel. I think the crisis is real, but I think there are 2 very different crises, a mass crisis and an elite crisis. The elite crisis, which shows up in most of the data, which shows that young American Jews under 35 or 40 are less attached to Israel than their parents and grandparents, is not primarily about Israeli politics. It's primarily about attachment to Judaism. When you have a population that is simply less and less of non-Orthodox young American Jews who are simply less and less attached to Judaism, it's not surprising that they are less and less attached to Israel. If they're not interested and know very little about Simchas Torah, you wouldn't expect them to know a lot and be very connected to Israel. So that problem, I think, can only be addressed at the level of Jewish education. We are arguably the wealthiest and most Jewishly illiterate community in Jewish history, even compared to other diaspora communities like Canada or Australia or Britain. American Jews don't have access to academically excellent, affordable, full-time Jewish schools in nearly the same way that they do in many of the other large diaspora communities. And that is, I think, the fundamental reason that you see this lack of attachment to Judaism, and Israel is simply one part of that. But there is another story, and it is an elite story outside the Orthodox community. Nothing I'm talking about applies to the Orthodox community, where you have a totally different story going on. If you look at the emerging leadership of the non-Orthodox American Jewish community, people who are graduating, young Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist rabbis, the independent Minyanim movement, which is the people who are creating Jewish social justice organizations. There's an enormous amount of very, very exciting stuff going on in terms of Jewish renewal. These are people who are deeply Jewishly committed, and they are, many of them, politically alienated over Israel. You can see it in the study that Avichai did in 2010 of what they called young non-establishment Jewish leaders. You can see it in the poll that JTA just did of their rabbis, where they found that older conservative rabbis were 48 points more likely to favor AIPAC over J Street, and younger conservative recent graduates were 16 points more likely to favor J Street, a huge political shift. You can see it in the study that the independent Minyanim did of its own members where they found that a very high percentage of them said they did not always feel proud of Israel. Overwhelming percentage of them said they supported a settlement freeze. And here, I think the question, the essential question is, can American Jews whose Zionism is not based on Israel as refuge, because it's very important to remember that the American Jewish community became a Zionist community overwhelmingly in the 30s and 40s because what happened in Europe and America's unwillingness to let European Jews in made the case in a very palpable way for the fact that you needed a Jewish state as refuge. For young American Jews who don't see any diaspora community in the world that needs Israel as refuge and don't feel the need themselves, the questions of the character of the Jewish state become more central to the very question of whether they identify as Zionists at all. And that's, I think, at the core of why you see this mounting alienation and willingness to question even fundamental questions about the rationale for a Jewish state amongst even those highly Jewishly committed young American Jews.
Every generation does have their relationship with Israel, and it's not our responsibility to dictate what that is to the next generation. And we need to allow them the space to do that. We can't treat the young people like they don't know any better, and that's why they're thinking the way they are. And we also can't assume that as they grow older, their positions are going to change. And I would add that in addition to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I really think young American or North American Jews are concerned with issues of religious pluralism, issues of how the Bedouin communities are treated. I've had a student answer the question, how do you advocate for Israel? And the way they do that is by supporting women of the wall. And we need to allow that to be acceptable within our advocacy terminology in the organized community.
When I was in college in the 80s, there was a book I read by Dr. Joyce Starr that talked about the U.S.-Israel relation called Kissing Through Glass. And it talked about the fact that we didn't really know each other. We weren't really in a relationship. We had stereotypes of one another. And what I see is very, very different from the students who we work with, from the over 300,000 young people who have traveled in this past decade to Israel and met with Israelis and have a relationship now with people there who they've met with and understand. A relationship about love is different than infatuation. In the past, perhaps, our community was infatuated with the narrative of Exodus, not so much the Exodus of the Bible, but maybe the Exodus of Leon Uris, or of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed star depicting Exodus. This generation, certainly, who was born after 1990, is not part of that same narrative. But these folks are coming back, and they are absolutely falling in love. They are falling in love, and as we all know as adults in this room, love is messy. Love is a relationship. You have arguments. You disagree. You see each other without makeup. You get over those things, but you continue a loving relationship. Now, that's not a fairy tale love, but it's a relationship that requires actually being in a conversation with one another. That's the Israel that I fell in love with as a young adult. That's the Israel that I see motivating the stories, the concerns, the issues, which include the hard questions being asked by young people, which I think everyone on this panel from different perspectives would agree. Young people ask hard questions. They don't want to just sit and listen to people up here tell them what their narrative should be about Israel. They have their own feelings. They have their own understandings. But I just want to share this one data point, and we'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure, over the course of the panel. If you look at the birthright data of these hundreds of thousands people encountering Israel for the first time, without a lot of background, and I agree with Peter in the idea that they don't have a strong Jewish background, a lot of these folks. This is indeed one of the aspects of this. This is an introduction. This is Judaism 101 for many of them. But when they go, what is the favorite thing that sticks with them? What is sticky from their experience? Is it Masada? No, it's actually the Mifgash. It's the meeting with Israeli young soldiers. It's the real-life narratives, not the fairy tale narratives. And that's, I think, really significant as we think about how are we going to reach this generation. We know it's not fact sheets they're looking for, debating points. We know from this program we do with the Jewish Agency, where we bring on 50 campus Israeli fellows, that they actually are enjoying meeting and learning about the lives of young Israelis. This is the beginning of a real serious loving relationship. But yeah, it's going to be messy.
Too often, there's an easy association between being pro-Israel and supportive of the policies of the Israeli government. I think there is not enough space created for people who say That for me, being pro-Israel is being in solidarity with the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which promises complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. And that forces me into profound conflict with an occupation that has lasted for 2/3 of Israel's existence and desecrates those ideals by not giving citizenship to Palestinians in the West Bank. Secondly, I think that in the effort to create red lines, lines about who is kosher and who isn't kosher, there is a profound imbalance, which is to say, if you question Israel's existence as a Jewish state, let me just stipulate, I don't. I'm a Zionist. I believe in Israel as a democratic Jewish state. But I believe it is harmful to draw a red line around Israel as a Jewish state if you're not also going to draw a red line around Israel as a democratic Jewish state, because I don't believe that Israel can survive as a non-democratic Jewish state. And if Israel permanently, essentially annexes the West Bank, it will be, in large measure, a non-democratic Jewish state, as both Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert have warned. So if you're going to be machmir about people who have questions, about questions that are also deep in our tradition, right? The same questions that Henrietta Schultz had, who founded Hadassah, the same questions that Judah Magnus had, founder of Hebrew University, the same questions that Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber had. If you don't want their descendants in the table, okay, at the table, fine. But then what are you going to tell me about the people, representatives from Likud? Because Likud Party's platform says explicitly there will be no Palestinian state, which means, to my mind, ultimately their vision is not of a democratic Jewish state. So I think if we have to recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, as it says in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which stresses liberal democratic values every bit as much as it stresses its Jewish identity. And if we're going to take one seriously, we have to take the other one equally seriously.
I would like some of that next generation in the group up here sharing with you why, for example, for them, they're very comfortable going to a J Street conference and an AIPAC conference. And as I said, loyalty to brands, and that may seem strange to some people in this room, but I am absolutely telling you, I could put numerous students up here who would explain to you, they're interested in hearing lots of interesting perspectives, and they think it's really actually sort of cool that our community has all these passionate people talking about Israel, and they'd like to form their own opinions. And by the way, if we're going to have everybody in the room, also who I'd like to see up here are Israelis on the panel. We should not be talking about Israel as a third party if we're in a loving relationship. Israelis are not the object of this discussion. They are our partners in our mishpacha in this conversation, and they need to be talking to us about what their tents mean in their society at this moment and how that is an expression of Jewish and democratic, because I don't think we completely get that. I think those are some of the discussions that I find from students to be the ones that suggest to them that it is not just a black and white thing. It's just not one organizational position or the other. And it's not even planks in the political parties of particular Israeli parties that is what sort of inspires them. What inspires them are people. What inspires them are being part of the conversation. And the more we invite them into the tent and show the community that we're not looking for ways to exclude them or judge them or have litmus tests about them, the more vibrant that conversation will be. And I think it'll make critics on all sides of the issue potentially have to rethink some of their strategies.
I guess the question that comes to mind when I hear discussions like we need to have a relationship with Israelis and we need to have Israeli voices is how you're defining Israelis. Because if you're defining the West Bank, the Palestinians of the West Bank have been under Israeli sovereignty since 1967. So to my mind, that makes them, whether we like it or not, until the day there is a Palestinian state, Israelis. There's only one state that has sovereignty and dominion over their lives. That's the state of Israel. What does it mean?
Wait, is that
what does it mean?
International law? You're claiming they're Israeli citizens?
No, they're not Israeli citizens, but Israel is the state that controls much of their lives. So the question is, when you talk about being in relationship with Israelis, does that mean that we have an obligation also to hear about those non-citizens who are under Israeli sovereignty? And if it does, and I think it actually should, then I think it makes the red lines that we're trying to establish very, very difficult. Even if you want to bring Israeli Arab citizens into the conversation, you're very likely going to be bringing in non-Zionist voices because, newsflash, most Israeli Arab citizens are non-Zionist. So if one defines Israeli as something other than Jewish Israeli, then I think it makes the kind of conversation that you want to have and the red lines that one wants to establish actually more difficult.
Peter, you started by saying you consider yourself a Zionist, and you started by saying you believe in a Jewish and democratic state. So, just to clarify, your sense is that to have a conversation about Israel today would require...
There's a 20% of Israel's own population are people who have profound problems with Zionism. I don't. I'm a Zionist. If you want to have a conversation with Israelis, and you don't only mean Jewish Israelis, but you mean all Israelis, even if you only mean within the Green Line, then it seems